A Vietnamese couple from New York arrived in the Swiss Bernina mountain range with the expectation that this hiking trip would be a memorable journey than their love story. But just 3 days later, Keen returned alone, exhausted from the cold, while Lean had gone missing amidst the snow and ice, leaving no trace. For 12 years, the family had to accept that she would forever remain in the harsh embrace of nature, until climate change triggered a violent avalanche, and the mountain began revealing truths no one dared to imagine it had been hiding in the fall of 2012. Keen Nguyen and Lien Tran, a Vietnamese couple living in New York, embarked on a long-planned hiking trip to Switzerland. Both were avid hikers, having conquered many peaks across the U.S. and Asia, but the Bernina Range was their greatest challenge. They stayed at a mountain lodge before setting out early the next morning on a familiar ice trail. However, just 2 days later, Keen returned alone, his body frail from the cold, while Lien had vanished without a trace. The door to the Steinblick guest house, which was heavy and old, had never been forced open like it had that night. A gust of icy wind slammed into the doorframe, and a figure collapsed at the threshold, his lips turning purple, hands swollen, and eyes seemingly half dead. He couldn't speak immediately, just slumped down, as though unaware of how he had survived to make it back. In the flickering light, no one recognized the frozen man as Keen Nguyen, a 31-year-old Vietnamese man from New York who had gone missing 3 days earlier in the Bernina Mountains with his girlfriend. Lien Tran, the guest house owner, and a few tourists helped him up, quickly wrapping him in a woolen blanket and trying to hand him a hot cup of tea. But his numb fingers could no longer hold anything. A local doctor was called in that night. In the tremors of his body, his teeth chattering and his breath shallow, Keen whispered 2 words: "Lien is gone." The police arrived early the next morning. In the small guest room, Keen sat like someone who had been drained of all life. His face was cracked from the cold wind, his beard thick, yet his gaze remained distant. He recounted how they had been climbing the famous ice route in Bernina, a journey they had prepared for meticulously. They were experienced climbers who had crossed many major mountain ranges in the U.S., but that morning, on the 3rd day of their climb, the weather changed suddenly. The snow didn't fall, but instead whipped across their faces, erasing all boundaries between the sky, land, and people. According to Keen, they had secured their safety ropes as any experienced climbers would. Lien was carefully stepping over a thin ice section when the ground beneath her suddenly vanished. Keen felt a sharp tug, then nothing more. The rope loosened, and there was no pulling force. He rushed to the edge of the ice shelf, calling her name into the howling wind, but no one responded. There were no cries for help, only a deep crevasse, swallowing everything. He couldn't descend. If he had clung to the rope, both of them might have perished. The wind grew stronger, and the snow covered the gap. He had no choice but to retreat, digging a temporary snow shelter where he stayed for over 2 days, with only a small amount of food and water from melting snow. Finally, when the weather cleared a little, he descended the mountain. His account was detailed enough to convince those listening. A mountaineering accident often happens swiftly, silently, and hopelessly like that. The police documented his statement, and the rescue team prepared to search the area Keen had described. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in a small apartment in New York City, Tran, Lien's younger sister, received a phone call at 3 a.m. The voice of the man from Switzerland spoke slowly in English, clearly fearing she wouldn't understand the shock that was about to hit her. Her sister had gone missing on the mountain, with almost no chance of survival. Tram stood frozen in the kitchen, her phone slipping from her hand, her mind blank. She couldn't believe it. This couldn't be true. Lien was the strongest person she had ever known. Her sister had never lost to any mountain. How could she have disappeared? Less than 12 hours later, Tram boarded the earliest flight to Zurich, then connected to a flight to the town near the Bernina Range. She hardly slept or ate, only carrying a small photo of the two of them together in Central Park years ago. The police greeted her at the guest house, where Keene was under medical observation. She looked at him, her sister's boyfriend of 3 years, unsure where to begin with her questions. Keene remained silent, his gaze vacant as though still trapped in the snow. The search operation began. The rescue team used helicopters to sweep over the area Keene had described. However, after 3 consecutive days with deep sub-zero temperatures and freshly fallen snow, no signs were found. No blood, no equipment, no clothing, no echoes. The Bernina Range seemed to have swallowed up all evidence, including a person. On the 8th day, the rescue team leader declared the search over. They could no longer send people into such a dangerous area when the chance of survival had become almost non-existent. A report was signed. Linh Tran was officially declared missing under uncontrollable circumstances. Her name was added to the list of those lost forever in the heart of the ice. Tram sat with her head bowed by the window of the guest house, still unable to believe that in just 1 week her life had been completely changed. Her sister was gone, and she hadn't even had the chance to say a final word. Deep down, something still felt wrong. But at that moment, all she had was the terrifying silence from the snow-covered mountain, and the only man who had returned, Keene Nguyen, the sole survivor of the trip. He was the last person to see Linh alive, and the only one who knew exactly what had happened, or, perhaps, was deliberately withholding the truth. The search began on the 2nd morning after Keene Nguyen was brought down from the mountain. The people in reflective vests emerged from the vehicles, bringing ropes, cameras to detect ice, and a small glimmer of hope that a miracle might still occur. Helicopters hovered throughout the morning, and detailed maps were printed, marking the coordinates of the area Keene had described. Everything was professional and cold, and no one spoke, despite the hope that they might be looking for someone who was already dead. Keene couldn't participate in the rescue. The doctors were still monitoring him closely, due to his weakened state and mild frostbite on his fingertips. However, in the few hours he was awake, he repeatedly told the police officer and translator, "We were in the southern area. There's a clear bump by the ice wall. If you find that, you'll definitely find the crack." He closed his eyes, stressing each word as though trying to hold on to that memory to keep himself from completely breaking down. Tram Tran could not sit still. She begged to accompany the search team in the helicopter, but her request was denied. She stood in the grass field behind the guest house, looking up at the gray clouds slowly drifting over the snow-covered mountain range. The thin, cold air made each breath feel like a sharp cut, but nothing hurt more than having to stand from a distance, watching others search for traces of her loved one, like looking for a lost item, both distant and hopeless. The first day passed without any progress. The helicopter reported that the snow was too thick, and the thermal camera couldn't detect any heat signals. Even the rescuers on foot couldn't identify which crevasse was the right one. The blizzard had erased the terrain. One of the team members told Tram, if she fell there, that crevasse might have closed up by now. The ice floor isn't flat. It's a cold maze with no echo. On the 2nd day, the rescue team split into 3 groups, spreading out in a fan shape from the suggested area. One person found a nylon cloth covered in ice, but it was just the wrapper of dry food. A suspected ice column, thought to be the place where her foot might have slipped, was carefully checked with cameras, but it was only about 1 meter deep. Tiny hopes were gradually extinguished by the harsh reality. The blizzard had done its job of hiding everything perfectly. Tram hardly ate anything. Each night, she wrote in her diary in Vietnamese, using a small notebook as if leaving messages for her sister. I am here waiting for you. The fact that they haven't found you doesn't mean you're gone. I can't believe the world went silent when you disappeared. I try so hard not to cry in front of others, but my red eyes and trembling hands are evidence I can't hide. On the third day, the rescue team brought in reinforcements from the nearby town. Seismic meters were deployed to locate weak spots under the ice. But when the 3D terrain map was created, they had to admit something. The location Keene had provided was too vague. Several large crevasses were checked, but no signs were found. Some of the rescuers whispered that if nothing was found soon, they would have to make a decision. That evening, the rescue team commander held an emergency meeting with the police and Tram's family. She was invited to attend. In the small wooden room, the yellowed oil lamp cast a dim light. The old commander placed his hand on a folder with a printed map of the terrain and spoke slowly. We've searched all the accessible dangerous areas. No signals suggest the victim is alive, nor that the body is in the designated area. The weather is about to worsen again. Continuing would threaten the safety of the team. A heavy silence filled the room. Tram tightened the edge of her coat, unable to speak. Everything she wanted to say was choked in her throat. On the fourth day, the search was officially called off, and the team withdrew. Tram was handed a confirmation letter. Linh Tran, a Vietnamese American citizen born in 1984, missing under extreme weather conditions in the Bernina Range. Probability of survival, 0. The chances of finding a body, extremely low. She held the letter as if it were a death sentence. For her faith, the ice gave no return, and no one asked for the truth anymore. That night, in the room covered in snow outside, Tram curled up, clutching the necklace her sister had worn, the only thing Linh left behind in the hotel room before the trip. Keene had not appeared since the meeting ended. He withdrew to his room, closed the door, and no sound was heard from inside. No one asked him anything further. He was the survivor, the victim, the only one to return. And as such, he was absolved of all suspicion. But in Tram's mind, there was a question that had never been erased. If they really had tied the ropes together, as he said, why, when her sister fell, did he remain standing there with no injury from the rope tugging? If the fall was strong enough to take a life, how could the other person not have been pulled along? Returning to New York in early October 2012, Keene Nguyen stepped out of JFK Airport in the eerie silence of someone who had just crossed through death. No reporters, no one waiting for him. His hand injuries were bandaged, his face still slightly swollen from the frostbite, but his posture had straightened. He walked out like someone who had survived, not in victory, but in solitude. Linh Tran's family held a simple memorial service at a small temple in Queens. Tram, dressed in a black dye, stood silently by the altar. A portrait of Linh was placed on the table, her eyes still shining with life, completely at odds with the conclusion from Switzerland. Lost forever under conditions where no body could be found. Keene was present. He placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, bowed his head silently, with no tears, no words, just a face unreadable. Time passed. Their story was mentioned a few times in mountaineering forums as a warning that weather could turn within an hour on the Ass Range. Some people referred to Keene as a miraculous survivor, an example of survival skills, but he never participated in any interviews. He didn't return to any mountaineering groups. It seemed that, for him, both the mountain range and his memories of it had died along with Linh. Instead of retelling, Keene chose to rebuild. He withdrew from social media, left his old friends behind, and dedicated all his time to his work. In architecture, drawings, permits, concrete buildings gradually replaced white mountain peaks. In 3 years, he became one of the co-founders of a new design company based in Soho. He lived minimally, only sharing his work, never mentioning his personal life. Then Julia Kim appeared, a Korean-American woman working in landscape design. Julia met Keen at a seminar on green architecture. She had a soft and reserved demeanor, her eyes always listening without judgment. They began to meet more often, and not long after, Julia moved into the glass apartment overlooking the park with Keen. At every small party hosted by friends, Julia was the one who spoke more. Keen, as always, remained calm, quiet, somewhat distant. When asked about the past, Julia only smiled, saying, "He went through a huge loss. I never force him to talk." To outsiders, Kim Nguyen seemed to be a model of calm, a man who lived with depth and overcame tragedy by rebuilding his life. But to Tran, the past wasn't so easy to pack into a memory box. She hadn't spoken to Keen since the memorial service. She didn't hate him, but always kept her distance, as if her instinct was still warning her. Something didn't feel right. In 2015, she passed by Keen's company headquarters. She almost went in just to talk, but when she saw him from a distance, in his neat suit, his cold gaze, and a slight smile to his business partner, she stopped. She stepped back. The man before her didn't seem like someone carrying the weight of a death. She returned to review the case files the Swiss police had sent to the family. The detailed report about the weather conditions, the coordinates provided by Keen, the testimonies, and the satellite images. And then, a question that had once been faint suddenly became crystal clear. Why wasn't he injured in the chest or hip where the climbing rope would have wrapped around, if indeed the rope was yanked hard when line fell? That question had remained in her mind for years. Not enough to accuse, but not enough to forget either. In 2020, Tran started working for a non-profit organization that helped families of the missing. During seminars, she heard many stories of people declared missing, but in truth were abandoned or even killed. She listened, took notes, and each time her sister's image resurfaced. Meanwhile, Keen seemed to have completely closed that chapter. He and Julia lived quietly. Their apartment was full of light, but there were no traces of the Bernina range. No photos, no mementos, no letters. The past was buried beneath the layers of brick and glass. And so, to everyone else, Keen was the man who had risen from the depths. Only one person didn't believe that, and had never stopped. 12 years. After that fateful day, the summer of 2024 came to the Bernina Range with an unusual heat wave. The prolonged heat lasted over a month, causing the permanent ice to retreat by several centimeters each day. On local stations, meteorologists called it an unprecedented melting season in the history of measurements. But no one expected that. What was melting wasn't just ice, but a secret that had been buried for over a decade. A local skier, familiar with the terrain and often wandering alone in remote areas, accidentally discovered a strange mark in the fractured ice. It was a tattered piece of fabric, stained and torn, but still clearly showing a mix of dark pink and purple, far too bright to be a natural object. He approached it, his gloves touching the edge of the fabric, and then he froze. Beneath the melting ice was a small, pale, skeletal arm, next to an old hiking boot with a crempin still attached, the metal tip still sharp under the sun. The local police were called in that same afternoon. A team of forensic experts was dispatched urgently. Everyone knew that what had been preserved in the ice for so long could not have been a coincidence. And just as they had felt when the remains were gradually excavated, the pinkish-purple jacket matched the description of the missing victim from 2012. Tran's body was found in Bernina, just as Tran was standing in the elevator of the Vietnamese community center where she worked. Her phone vibrated softly, and the message from the Swiss police was brief. "We have found remains believed to be of Lien Tran, Please call us as soon as possible." Her heart skipped a beat. She had to grip the side of the elevator to avoid collapsing. On the flight back to Switzerland after 12 years, Tram carried a small suitcase, an old file from the missing person case, and a scarf her sister had knitted. Memories that she had once locked away, thinking they were buried in time, began to surface one by one. The police met her at the local investigation office. They were no longer as cold as before. Their voices were softer, almost apologetic. They led her to the forensic examination room. On the stainless steel table, in a plastic medical bag, was the pinkish-purple jacket, partly decayed. A large hiking boot, not belonging to a woman, and several pieces of cleaned bones. Tram didn't cry. She just stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the jacket. Something didn't match. The lead investigator, Marcus Heller, spoke slowly. This body was found more than 8 kilometers away from the area Keen Nguyen had reported. He looked at her. "We are considering the possibility that the original location was deliberately misrepresented." At the same time, in the Forensic Institute, an experienced elderly doctor stood silently for a long time before the reconstructed skull. On the top and back of the skull, there were several indentations that couldn't have been caused by a free fall. Some of the marks were small round punctures, as if a sharp object had pierced through. When the diameter was measured, it matched perfectly with the sharp tip of a crampon. The doctor didn't immediately provide a conclusion, but in her heart, she knew this wasn't an accident. This was an intentional injury. The information was passed on to Marcus Heller. He flipped through the old case files. There was a photo of the couple smiling with a tourist on the morning of the accident. But now, the boot in the photo worn by Keen Nguyen, a specialized hiking boot with yellow laces, matched the boot found next to Lean's remains. The problem was, this was a man's size 45 European shoe, which couldn't possibly belong to her. Questions began to flood in. Why was the body in a different location? Why were there repeated head injuries? Why was there a man's boot next to the remains? And why was the other boot, with the intact crampon, still kept in Keen Nguyen's storage? In New York, preserved like a souvenir? Tram was taken to the storage room, where the evidence was displayed. She saw the boot, the remaining crampon, and the analysis results showing a match between the metal crack on the crampon and the bone markings. She took the sheet of paper, her hands trembling, her eyes blurred. Not from pain, but because the truth had finally spoken. Leaving the Forensic Institute, she stood in the parking lot, looking up at the Bernina Range from a distance. It was still cold, still white, but now she was no longer afraid of it. What was more terrifying were the people and what they could do to each other when no one was watching. The forensic examination room of the Graub-Breinden Forensic Institute was always cold. But today, the cold didn't come from the air conditioning. It came from the skull placed neatly on the stainless steel table, a remnant that the ice had kept for 12 years. Standing before it was an experienced forensic expert, someone who had witnessed all forms of death in these mountain regions. But she had never had to stop and stare for this long. Not because of the broken bones, but because of the way they were broken. The wounds on Lean Tran's skull didn't resemble any injuries caused by a fall from height or by the impact of ice. She flipped through the CT scan and pointed to 3 small, almost evenly spaced round indentations, arranged in a curved line along the back of the skull. 2 of them were slightly off-center to the left, the exact spot where a right-handed person would strike from behind. Those small holes couldn't have been caused by natural rocks or ice dot next to them, or fragments of the skull that had been crushed inward, signs of extreme force, with no cracks radiating out like the damage from a fall. But the typical mark of a sharp and hard object repeatedly impacting the area. The forensic doctor walked to the evidence display table and took out the crampon found alongside the body. 12 steel tips, still sharp, still cold, when measuring the diameter of the metal tips and comparing them with the puncture marks in the skull. The results matched perfectly. A metal expert was called in to examine the remaining Krampen. The Krampen had been seized from Keen Nguyen's personal storage in New York. Under the electron microscope, 3 of the 12 Krampen tips showed signs of microdamage, small chips, compression marks, and molecular deformation. These were not scratches from rock climbing, but signs of a strong puncture into a hard yet flexible material, like human flesh. The results were handed over to Marcus Heller, the lead investigator. He skimmed through it, paused, then read it again. The words tore apart the ice that had once covered the 2012 report. There was no doubt left. Lien Tran didn't die in an accident. She was murdered, and the weapon wasn't a knife or a gun, but the most familiar item in mountaineering, the Krampen of her companion. Heller returned to his office. He asked to reopen the old photo files. The photo taken by the German tourist couple in 2012. The image of Lien and Keen, smiling brightly against the backdrop of white snow, now enlarged in detail. The sunlight touched the yellow metal spikes attached to Keen's boots. Same model, same color, same style. And now the other boot was lying beside Lien's remains. The entire investigative team held their breath. The pieces began to fall into place. The incorrect coordinates. The body found more than 8 kilometers from where it was reported. Signs of direct assault, blood and bone on the Krampen. Men's boot that couldn't possibly belong to the victim. It was no longer a coincidence. This was the logical sequence of a murder staged as an accident. Marcus Heller leaned back in his chair. In the initial files, Keen Nguyen had been considered the survivor, the victim, the man who lost his girlfriend in the blizzard. But his silence over the last 12 years was no longer grief. It was a veil, a calculation. He had sent the rescue team to the wrong place, letting nature do the rest. He had lived peacefully for 12 years, as though nothing had ever happened. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for. Ice could bury a crime, but it couldn't erase the truth. Heller ordered an urgent search warrant. A team, in cooperation with the New York police, conducted a search of Keen's home. In the basement, where his parents had once lived, now abandoned, they found an old mountaineering bag. Climbing spikes, harnesses, and the remaining Krampen perfectly matched the one found at the scene. The metal structure analysis matched as well. Both Krampens told the same story, and that story was colder than anything the ice could preserve. Back in Zurich, Tran sat across from Marcus Heller in his office. He didn't need many words. He simply placed 2 things in front of her, the photo of the Krampen and the forensic report. She stared at them for a long time before nodding slowly, but decisively. Her eyes were no longer red, but gleaming, as if for the first time in 12 years, she knew she had been right. And her sister would finally be given a voice. The interrogation room was on the 3rd floor of the Graubünden police headquarters. The room wasn't large. The cold gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs facing each other, no one-way mirrors, no handcuffs, only silence, and a recording device blinking red and black. Keen Nguyen was invited to assist with the reinvestigation of the old missing person case. He wasn't handcuffed, nor was he coerced. He arrived alone, neat, polite, exuding the calm of a man who had learned to live with his past. But he didn't know that today wasn't for exchanging information. It was the day the truth would knock on his door. Marcus Heller entered. His gaze wasn't harsh, nor was it soft. It was simply the gaze of someone who already knew the answer, but still wanted to hear the perpetrator say it himself. Heller turned on the recorder and began slowly. "We appreciate your return to Switzerland to assist with the investigation," he said. Keen nodded. "I also hope everything is cleared up. Every day I think about it." Heller didn't respond. He opened a file and pulled out the first photo. It was of Linh Tran's skull with the round puncture marks like metal tips. Heller slid the photo toward Keen, speaking evenly. The forensic doctor concluded this is not a fracture from a fall. These are injuries caused by a sharp object repeatedly piercing the skull. She didn't fall. She was murdered. Keen stared at the photo. His eyelids flickered slightly, but he didn't look down, nor did he look away. He didn't react like someone who had just received devastating news. He simply whispered, "Maybe it was the impact after she fell." His voice was low, almost uncertain. Heller didn't say anything. He took out the second photo that Crampon found next to the body. "This is yours," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but it was heavy as stone. Size 45? It couldn't be hers. The break in the metal tip matches the puncture marks on the bones and the other Crampon. He placed a bag of evidence on the table, items found in Keen's storage in New York. Every scratch, every molecule of metal matched not only physically, but also in time, and in the damage structure. Keen stared at the evidence bag, his eyes fixed on it for a long while before he leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together without a word. Heller waited 1 minute, then 2, then 5. No words, no objections, no explanations. Just silence so thick it seemed to drain all the air from the room. Heller continued. "We also found out that the body was discovered more than 8 kilometers away from the location you reported. Ice can't move that quickly. No glacial flow moved from the north to the discovery area, and only one person led the rescue team in the wrong direction. That was you." Keen closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his gaze was no longer firm, but still, he didn't speak. Heller leaned forward and tilted his head. "You said you tied the ropes, and if she fell, the pull must have been strong. But in your medical report, there's no bruise around her waist, no rope burns. Where's the rope, Keen?" There was no answer. Heller suddenly stood up. He walked over to the file cabinet in the corner, pulled out a simulation drawing of the injuries, and photos of the 2 Crampons placed side by side. "I could keep presenting more evidence. We have photos from 2012, testimony from her friends about her wanting to break up with you before the trip. There's even an audio recording from a guide she asked for directions from just 1 day before she went missing. But what I want to hear today is from you." Keen looked straight at the simulation board. His hand was placed on the table, his fingers clenched. For a brief moment, his lips tightened, his eyes flaring with anger, suppressed deep inside him, but only for a second. Then, all of it crumbled away. He turned his face away and looked at the corner of the room. "I want to see a lawyer." His voice was calm to the point of being eerie. Heller stared at him for a long time, then nodded. He pressed the stop button on the recorder. The interrogation was over. As Keen was let out, Marcus Heller glanced at the case file, and in his mind, there were no more questions. Everything had been answered. The man who had sat across from him for the last hour was no longer a victim, no longer a survivor, but someone who had spent 12 years walking on his own, carrying a lie so big that even he almost believed it. No more. When the interrogation room door closed behind Keen Nguyen, the investigation shifted to a crucial phase, uncovering the motive. Marcus Heller knew that to accuse a man after 12 years, with mostly indirect evidence, they would need more. And rusted metal and a broken skull. They needed to understand the why, to reconstruct the psychological picture behind the actions. No one kills in the middle of a desolate mountain range without some crack from within beforehand. A group of investigators began to trace back in time. They sought out old friends, members of the climbing group from that year. People who had dined, hiked, and listened to conversations that at the time seemed harmless. And from that, a different version of the relationship between Linh Tran And Kim Nguyen began to emerge. One of Lean's friends, who had studied at the New York Design School, recalled that a few weeks before the trip to Switzerland, Lean confided in her about feeling suffocated in the relationship. Keen is smart, really smart, but he wants to control everything. She had said that the trip wasn't just a vacation. She wanted clarity about whether this love was still a partnership or had become a prison made of snow. Another friend, a fellow member of the climbing club, remembered how Keen had gotten angry during a birthday party when another man offered Lean a drink. "I've never seen anyone switch from calm to explosive so quickly," the friend said. "But what chilled me was the way he hid his anger afterward. A smile, an apology, everything went back to normal, as if nothing had happened." Marcus Heller pieced it all together. A man skilled at controlling himself, a relationship cracking under pressure, a trip far from anyone who could witness it, a death no one saw, and a survival story that lasted 12 years. Heller began to reconstruct the most likely scenario. Perhaps it was in the moment when Line said goodbye, in the endless expanse of Bernina, that something inside Keen snapped. She was the last person he believed was his. When she sought freedom, he chose the only way to keep control, cutting it off permanently. Not with words, but with steel, with ice, with silence. The legal language is the language of reason, but the motive is the voice of the soul. Heller knew that to bring this case to light, he would need to rewrite the entire truth, not just in a report, but in a story. A story convincing enough to make a jury believe that the man was not simply the victim of a snowstorm, but the one who caused the storm. As witness testimonies were recorded, Lean's file began to thicken. She had reset her email password, looked for a new apartment, and left a handwritten note for a friend. "If I leave and don't come back, you'll let everything sink into silence." That note had once been dismissed by her friend as a joke. Now it echoed from the past, painful and eerily accurate. Meanwhile, in New York, Julia Kim, Keen's current girlfriend, was invited to work with the police. At first, she refused to say much, but when she saw the full case file, she admitted that there were nights when Keen would dream of snow and wake up gasping for air. There were times he sat by the window all night without saying a word. "I thought it was psychological trauma, but now I'm not sure." That simple but haunting statement was added to the file. It wasn't evidence of guilt, but it was another slice of the real person behind the calm exterior. In Zurich, Tram Tran sat alone in a small cafe near the police station. Before her lay a translated witness statement. She read every line again, the casual words from the past now turning into clues. The pain within her was no longer an invisible mass. It had a name, a face, a reason, and above all, it had an ending that was being rewritten. In that moment, Tram didn't cry. She simply took her pen and wrote one sentence in the margins of the document. "He didn't kill my sister out of hatred. He killed her out of fear of losing control." The case file was complete, the evidence thoroughly organized. The forensic testimony and the motive had been established. Marcus Heller signed the arrest warrant for Kim Nguyen on a late July afternoon. He believed that in a few days they would bring that man to light, but what neither Heller nor the entire investigation team could foresee was the only thing Keen had left: time. While the legal authorities were preparing for a public arrest and media presentation, Keen and Julia Kim disappeared. Without a word, without a trace. The New York police stormed his apartment under the search warrant, but it was empty clean to the point of being unsettling. No personal belongings, no clothes, no photos, no evidence that this had ever been a home, just faint imprints on the carpet where the furniture once stood. That very night, Marcus Heller issued an international arrest warrant. Major airports were checked again, but they didn't find the two names on any commercial flights. They had traveled by land using a second passport an expertly forged one, prepared months earlier. A series of bank transactions were discovered. Keen's entire fortune, both personal and corporate, had been withdrawn in just 72 hours before his disappearance. The money had been transferred through several intermediary banks in Southeast Asia, and from there, the trail faded nothing more to follow. Tran received the news of Keen's flight while at the airport on her way back to New York, stood motionless between two immigration officers, the notice from the Swiss police shaking in her hands. After years of silence, waiting for justice, now that all the evidence was clear, he had vanished. As though justice was nothing more than an ideal concept, rather than a reality. No trial, no accusations, no moment where he had to face the photo of the person he killed and say his final words. Just silence, with a jar of ashes sent back from Switzerland, and a piece of the truth no longer buried under the ice. In the press, the case was called the frozen crime, a murder concealed by the weather and silence. Keen Nguyen's image was spread across Interpol's systems, but no one saw him again. Not in Europe, not in America, not on any map. Marcus Heller closed the file and placed it in the top drawer. "We have the truth," he said, "but we have no justice." And that was the only statement he left in his final report. As for Tram, after everything, she didn't choose anger. She returned to Brooklyn, quietly holding on to her sister's necklace, the last remaining item from that trip. On the gravestone, erected in a small cemetery, a brief inscription read, "Lien Tran, 1984 to 2012. No one can kill light. It only retreats to wait to be found." True love is not about control, not about possession, and not about turning the other person into an object. That must be kept at all costs. When love is twisted into power, jealousy, and control, it is no longer love but violence disguised by closeness. This story is a warning to those lost in what seems like a romantic feeling, but is actually a thin line between love and destruction. Be cautious of the signs of control in the name of love, because loving the wrong way can sometimes not only break a person, but kill a soul. The truth may be buried under ice for many years, but it never dies. Justice may come late, or may never come, but every step toward the truth is a reminder that silence cannot protect what is right. In a world full of deceit and facades, the courage of those who refuse to give up like Tram is the flame that keeps memories alive, giving the victim their final voice. Because justice is not only about punishment, but about restoring the human value that was taken away. If you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to spread these human values. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for listening and for being with us.